Would winning those millions of pounds you've always dreamed of actually make you happy? Emerald Fennell's new masterpiece, Saltburn, is an amazing movie which really delves into the intricate relationship between wealth, privilege, and trauma. And for those of you who have yet to see Saltburn, go and save this video to watch later as there will be spoilers. The narrative centres around the affluent Catton family, where opulence seems to veil the characters in a facade of perfection. But as the story unfolds, it becomes very clear that behind the polished exterior lies a tapestry of hidden trauma, woven by the very privileges that are supposed to offer them comfort. The film beautifully portrays how wealth, instead of being a shield against hardship, can actually create its own set of traumas. Before we begin, I just want to caveat that as a professional who's worked at both ends of the wealth spectrum, I completely appreciate and understand the complexities of multiple deprivation and poverty. And this video is in no way meant to minimise those experiences. But I do feel the trauma that lies behind elite wealth is a topic that is grossly overlooked, and an area I work with every day in my own private practice. Saltburn beautifully shows us how trauma transcends socioeconomic class. It challenges us as viewers to reflect on our own perceptions of privilege. So today, let's look at some of the traumas experienced by the characters in Saltburn and how this impacts them psychologically. With elite wealth often comes staff, but with staff often comes children being cared for almost exclusively by paid help. Across generations of families, I see the emotional disconnect that comes with being raised by staff. Whilst of course this lives on a spectrum, my own son had a part-time nanny for some time. Being brought up almost completely by paid help means that there's a real emotional disconnect between the children and their parents. This emotional disconnect can cause huge attachment trauma. There's often a lack of care, a lack of understanding, inconsistency when staff turn over, and the very real trauma of those staff leaving when children come of age. We want our primary caregivers, whoever they may be, to love us consistently and unconditionally. But what actually happens in many of these scenarios is that insecure and avoidant attachment begin to develop in the home. And this can also spiral into a real fear of abandonment. I think in Saltburn we really beautifully see this disconnect between the parents and the children. Boundaries often appear very, very blurred. Communication is often stilted and emotionally repressed. And in many ways, Felix and Venetia's parents often act like impulsive children themselves. Now, for those of you who attended a boarding school and enjoyed it, chef's kiss, I love that for you. But for the majority of patients I've worked with who attended boarding school from a young age, this experience has been very traumatic. When swapping life stories with Oliver as they bond in the first act of Saltburn, we hear Felix make a quip about experiencing abuse at boarding school. But this may not come in the form you might expect. When we're being sent to boarding school from a very young age, our upbringing and emotional care is being put in the hands of an institution, as well as strict and punitive rules that have to be adhered to, and the possibility of bullying and isolation. Boarding schools can in fact be very emotionally fraught institutions. Again, hashtag not all boarding schools. But I will be transparent and say that as a professional who works with pupils and alumni from some of the top boarding schools in the UK, I don't have a huge amount of positive things to say about them. Farleigh is an important character in more ways than one. Though being fully funded through Oxford University and living at Saltburn between semesters, Farleigh is technically homeless. I think there continues to be a huge amount of confusion over what it means to be homeless, because the reality is it is a very broad spectrum. Now, I'm in no way going to minimise here the very all-consuming trauma of anyone sleeping rough, a challenge that for us in the UK is becoming all too common an occurrence for people. But what we might not realise is that many others we encounter may actually have no fixed address. They may be sofa surfing, living in hostels or hotels, Or like Farleigh, be unable to go home because it's such an emotionally or physically unsafe space. Kinship care occurs in our official care system here in the UK when a child or teenager is homeless or unable to return to home, and they are instead taken in by a family member. But what I often see in circles of elite wealth is that this kinship care or homelessness goes unseen. Wealth becomes a barrier to the visibility of homelessness, and it means that many of these young people and adults do not get the appropriate support or care they need. It sounds like Farleigh actually had a very traumatic childhood, living with a parent with an addiction. And it sounds very unlikely that he was ever given any emotional or psychological support for this. Whilst of course it's wonderful to have Saltburn as his home and his elite education paid for, he notes how he has to go to his carers, the Cattons, with a begging bowl every time he needs for something, as well as having to care and advocate for his own mother from a distance, and the emotional toll this is understandably taken on him. Carey Mulligan plays the beautiful but troubled Pamela, a family friend to the Cattons who's staying with them after a stint in rehab. Similar to Farleigh's mother, Pamela admits to struggles with drugs and alcohol, and sadly later on in the movie Pamela dies. The availability of drugs and alcohol in the wealth bubble never ceases to amaze me. I myself remember being 15 years old and being offered my first sprinkling of snow, shall we say, from another privately educated peer. And no, don't worry, I didn't take it. With wealth comes the availability of excess. Money truly can buy anything, and for many, it's buying drugs and alcohol to cope with their unprocessed traumas. No matter the event, whether it be simply the wine at the breakfast table or the huge number of drugs consumed at Oliver's birthday party, excess is seen everywhere. But for Pamela, Farleigh's mother, and I would suggest Farleigh himself, drugs and alcohol have become a much bigger coping mechanism. It's become a way for them to distance themselves from their struggles and traumas, to temporarily shut down their intrusive thoughts and memories. Whilst, of course, we see drugs and alcohol being used as a coping mechanism in areas of multiple deprivation and poverty, the availability and socially accepted nature of drugs and alcohol in the wealth bubble can be pretty staggering. Well, it wouldn't be a video of my own if we didn't touch on my topic of eating disorders. A character I truly felt for in Saltburn was Ventita, a young woman so obviously emotionally neglected by both of her parents, she has turned to bulimia as a way of coping. Bulimia nervosa remains one of the most common eating disorders here in the UK. And it's a coping mechanism I regularly see coming out of private education. Whilst we don't learn a huge amount about Ventita's background, she reminds me of so many of the wonderful young women I work with in my own practice. Intelligent, lovely, funny, beautiful young woman, simply looking to be seen, heard and loved. Instead, for Ventita, throughout the movie, we see her ridiculed by her mother and her challenges and struggles ignored by her father.
Eating disorders are, in essence, a coping mechanism that we have subconsciously developed to help us deal with unprocessed trauma. And as seen in this video, that means that wealth is not a buffer to eating disorders developing. In fact, wealth can often, as discussed, be a catalyst for eating disorders developing. Not only is Ventita not getting the appropriate support that she needs, but her trauma is being compounded within Saltburn.
There have been a number of studies which show that as we accumulate more wealth, our empathy and compassion for others declines. This is illustrated perfectly in a number of ways in Saltburn, namely with Elspeth and Felix. Both characters see people as objects, as novelties. With Felix, Oliver actually manipulates this, crafting an imaginary background of multiple deprivation and addiction in his home life, because Oliver knows that this will become a novelty for Felix. We see Felix throughout the movie consistently discarding people like they're old toys he no longer wants to play with. And this is noted by Ventita when Oliver begins at Saltburn. Whilst Rosamund Pike is comedy gold in this movie, we see her character Elspeth seeing people as a spectacle, as a show, as a funny anecdote to share at dinner. She has no real compassion for the people around her. This emotional disconnect from people in the world around us can be very traumatic. Not only does it become very challenging to make real and true connections being so emotionally disconnected, with this level of wealth, it can be hard to know whether somebody wants to be in your life because they truly like you as a person, or in Oliver's case, because they want your money and lifestyle. Of course, the biggest difference that I see as a professional between poverty and elite wealth when it comes to trauma is that the latter have the finance to get support and to do something about the trauma they've experienced if they want to. But it's also important to note that this doesn't minimise the traumas of those living in the wealth bubble. I know this video will be a controversial one, so if you have liked it, go and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel to see more videos of psychology on screen. I'll see you soon, my love.